I'm laying this out plainly. As an independent analyst focused on strategy and security, what's unfolding around Greenland isn't a misunderstanding, a clumsy negotiating tactic, or empty tough talk. It's a direct stress test of the entire post-war transatlantic alliance system. And when the fuse is being lit by a U.S. president, that should send shockwaves through anyone who understands how influence, trust, and deterrence actually function in the real world. Imagine an American leader openly threatening tariffs against European allies unless they concede control over part of their own territory. That isn't strength. It isn't smart leverage. It's the deliberate unraveling of the partnership network that turned U.S. power into leadership rather than chaos. Greenland is not a bargaining chip. It is a self-governing territory tied to Denmark through law, history, and mutual consent. Treating it as something up for grabs signals to allies and adversaries alike that Washington is willing to blur the line between legitimate negotiation and outright coercion backed by economic punishment. Europe's response shows the damage is already underway. Germany, France, the UK, Denmark, and others did not coordinate reactions out of habit or symbolism. They did so because they recognized a pattern. Tariffs are no longer being used to resolve trade disputes. They are being weaponized for unrelated political pressure. That crosses a line. Once partners conclude that access to U.S. markets can be threatened over territorial demands, the glue holding alliances together begins to crack. The way these demands are being delivered only worsens the impact. Public ultimatums on social media, personal deadlines, and rhetoric framing allied leaders as obstacles to be crushed rather than partners to persuade all signal volatility. Volatility destroys deterrence. Effective deterrence requires consistency, restraint, and credibility. If allies cannot predict whether the U.S. will defend them or trade them away, they begin planning for a future where American guarantees are conditional or unreliable. That shift is already visible. European discussions about counter-tariffs, anti-coercion tools, and even restricting U.S. trade access are not empty threats. They are contingency plans. The fact that instruments designed to counter hostile powers are now being discussed in relation to Washington speaks volumes. Once those mechanisms are activated, the damage to U.S. European economic ties will not be easily reversed. Canada's position deepens the concern. Quiet criticism of Canada's northern defenses, combined with escalating pressure over Greenland, sends deeply confused signals. Arctic security is not an intimidation to lead. It needs discipline, clarity, and respect for the systems that sustained its influence for decades. If this trajectory continues, the Greenland episode will not be remembered as a momentary misstep, but as a warning sign, the point at which allies began recalculating whether American unpredictability had crossed from inconvenience into threat. Trust, once broken, takes far longer to rebuild than it does to destroy. This is not theoretical. When allies lose confidence, they don't wait for clarifications or walkbacks. They quietly hedge, diversify partnerships, and reduce dependence. I've seen this progression before. Shock, anger, then cold calculation. Europe has already entered the calculation phase. The implications are stark. When the U.S. shifts from stabilizing force to perceived coercer, alliances stop amplifying power and start absorbing zero-sum contest among allies. It requires coordination, intelligence sharing, and joint investment to counter Russian and Chinese ambitions. Turning shared threats into grievances weakens collective defense and invites adversaries to exploit the cracks. What is most alarming is how casually core norms are being discarded. Respect for borders is not an abstract principle. It is the foundation of international stability. The moment the U.S. treats territorial integrity as optional when convenient, every adversary takes note. Moscow watches. Beijing watches. They judge not by rhetoric, but by behavior. If America treats Allied land as negotiable through economic coercion, it forfeits moral authority to condemn territorial aggression elsewhere. Supporters of this approach argue it is simply hard-nosed deal-making, that allies need to contribute more and face uncomfortable negotiations. Pressing for fair burden sharing is legitimate. Fusing that goal with overt coercion is not. Historically, effective U.S. diplomacy combined pressure with reassurance, kept sensitive leverage private, and preserved trust even amid disputes. What we're seeing now is pressure without reassurance, spectacle without strategy. This episode also highlights the danger of policy driven by personal fixation rather than institutional process. Decisions involving territory, alliances, and defense commitments should be grounded in legal review, intelligence assessments, and long-term strategy, not impulsive announcements. When that discipline collapses, partners stick in, markets destabilize, and adversaries probe for weakness. Greenland's population has been unequivocal: no sale, no transfer, no intimidation. Ignoring that reality reinforces the perception that Washington dismisses democratic consent when it becomes inconvenient. That perception doesn't stay confined to Europe. It shapes how allies in Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere assess U.S. intentions. This isn't about personalities. It's about strategic consequences. A worldview that treats allies as disposable and rules as optional leaves the U.S. isolated among cautious friends and emboldened adversaries. And the tragedy is that none of this is necessary. The United States already possesses immense economic, military, and diplomatic power. It does not need it. Legal frameworks governing Greenland frameworks the U.S. itself helped establish after World War II are being undermined. That weakens every American argument against territorial aggression worldwide. Using tariffs as a default weapon for non-trade disputes corrodes their effectiveness, destabilizes markets, and drives partners to seek alternatives. Power erodes gradually, often invisibly, until a crisis exposes the hollowing out. The Arctic should be an arena of unity, not division. Russia is militarizing its northern coast. China claims near-Arctic status despite geography. Alienating Denmark and Canada over internal disputes weakens the very coalition needed to deter genuine threats. True strength is controlled, credible, and disciplined. Loud coercion aimed at allies may generate domestic applause, but it burns leverage where it's most needed. History shows that U.S. leadership was never about raw force alone. It was about trust that power would be used responsibly. Greenland is not a test of American toughness against adversaries. It is a test of judgment among friends, and, so far, it is being failed. If this path continues, the damage will linger long after the rhetoric fades. Trust dents slowly, but heals slowly too, and adversaries exploit every moment of hesitation. This should be treated as a warning, not a model. The U.S. can still reset course, but it requires restraint, RSIS, and respect for allies, not pressure theatrics. Leadership isn't seized, it's sustained, and once that lesson is forgotten, power becomes louder, lonelier, and weaker.